All right, here we go. I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research. Some of you know that. Thank you very much. Welcome to tonight's presentation, which is the second event of our Creative Thought Forum series exploring the issue of social inequality. Tonight's speaker is Professor Mark Rank of Washington University, St. Louis, who will speak on the topic, the paradox of economic hardship among American prosperity. Before I say more about Professor Rank, I just wanted to thank some of our funders. First of all, our board members, some of whom are here, thank you very much for your support. I also want to thank the Patricia Foshi Charitable Fund, Santa Fe Dining, Dan Marion's UBS Wealth Management, REDW Investment Managers, the Vortman Endowment Fund, Adobo Catering, SAR's Founders Society members, and if you're here, thank you, and Newman's Own Foundation and Thornburg Investment Management. And I also want to thank our members. I can't see you out there, so I won't ask how many of you are members, but membership at any level is really important to supporting our activities and making events like this possible. So if you're not a member, take a look at our website, sarweb.org, and you can explore the options that are available to you by joining us, which then means you get much more regular communications on events and other useful information. A quick comment about the format. Our speaker tells me that his talk will last probably less than 40 minutes. So after that, we're going to shift to a question and answer period, and we'll have some microphones up here in the front, I believe, at that point. So keep in mind that some of you have registered for the now full informal discussion tomorrow at SAR with Mark Rank. Why don't you hold your questions for that, and people who are not going to be part of that event tomorrow, feel free to come ask questions, and he will do his best to answer them, keeping in mind that we have a kind of a fixed dinner appointment later this evening that I'll be holding you to, and I'm sure you understand that. One other thing, please remember to mute your phones and iPhones during this event. Mine is muted. I'm sure there's one or two cell phones here in the audience, like maybe 250. So please turn them off or mute them. Our speaker is Mark Rank. He's the Herbert Hadley Professor of Social Welfare at Washington University, St. Louis. He's the author of at least 10 books. It's really a pretty amazing resume, I have to say. Countless journal articles, most of which are focused on understanding poverty and its causes. He's also made more than a score of TV and radio appearances. His expertise has been recognized by members of the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as many national organizations involved in issues of economic and social justice. If you find his talk engaging, as I'm sure you will, I recommend that you look at his website, really a beautiful and useful website called confrontingpoverty.org. So please join me in giving a big Santa Fe welcome to Mark Rank.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, so much for that introduction. And I'd like to, first off, thanks the School for Advanced Research and Michael for inviting me here this weekend, and also to congratulate them on the excellent work that they've done over the years. I had a chance to kind of look at some of the things that they were involved with, and it's very impressive. So it's really a pleasure for me to be a part of this creative thought program on inequality, and to get to share some thoughts and ideas with you tonight. Now, as Michael said, I plan on taking about 40 minutes in terms of my talk, and then we'll have some time for discussion and questions that you might have. But I do need to warn you that one should always be cautious when you ask academics to speak. And that is, they're notorious for either going beyond their allotted time, or that it seems as if they've gone beyond their allotted time because time appears to slow down when they're talking. And there was a great story about this from a friend of mine who teaches at Yale. And it was his first year of teaching. It's always hard the first year. And he got through and got to the end of the course. And after the course was over, he was going through his first year evaluations. And they weren't so good. But then he got to this one, and it started off by saying, "I just wanted to let you know, Professor, that if I only had 15 minutes left to live, I'd want to spend them with you. And he thought, wow, this is really great. But then it went on to say, because you'd make those 15 minutes seem like an hour. So let's hope my 40 minutes here don't seem like 3 hours. All right, so let me begin my comments with a fundamental puzzle and a paradox, which is kind of the theme of my talk tonight. And that is, why is it that in America, which is the wealthiest country in the world, one also finds the highest rates of poverty in the industrialized world? And this is, of course, the subject of my latest book entitled The Poverty Paradox: Understanding Economic Hardship Amid American Prosperity. So whether we look at children's rates of poverty, poverty among working-age adults, poverty among single-parent families, the story is pretty much the same. And that is that the US has far and away the highest rates of poverty within the high economy or the OECD countries. Now, although there are several possible explanations for why this might be, the one that I want to develop here is that a major reason for this has to do with how we as a society have thought about this issue, and based on that thinking, how we've acted, or better put, failed to act on the issue. The focus of much of my work has been to lay out a new framework for thinking about and acting towards the issues of poverty and inequality in the US. And the focus of my latest book is in developing this perspective regarding poverty. So what I want to do here this evening is to discuss what I think are three of the more important changes in thinking that I feel are critical in reframing this issue. And my overall point is going to be that I don't think we'll be able to make much progress in reducing high rates of poverty and inequality until we dramatically shift how we understand these issues. So the three changes that I want to talk about today is that first, we need to shift our understanding of poverty from seeing it as something that happens to others to understanding it as an issue that affects us all. Second, we need to recognize that a major cause behind why US rates of poverty are so high is not to be found in individual failings, but rather in weaknesses at the economic and the political levels. And third, the moral ground on which we should look at poverty in this country needs to be one of injustice and the need for social change, rather than the all too common viewpoint of looking at poverty through the lens of individual blame, which then leads to inaction and a continued acceptance of high levels of poverty. So my argument is going to be that for us as a society to make substantial progress in reducing the extent of poverty in this country, a beginning step is to alter our understanding of the issue. So let me turn now to each one of these changes and provide a bit of detail in terms of what I'm kind of talking about in terms of each one of those. So the first change is to recognize that poverty indeed affects us all. Now, all too often, I think the viewpoint in the past has been that poverty affects someone else but not me. That the problem of poverty is confined to certain areas and neighborhoods, such as inner cities, and that I can largely avoid those areas and simply not deal with it. The notion is often one of out of sight and out of mind. And therefore, poverty is simply not high on my list of priorities. Well, the argument that I want to make is that this perspective is clearly incorrect, and that in one way or another, poverty does indeed affect us all. And there are at least two ways of thinking about this. The first is that whether we realize it or not, we all wind up paying a very steep price for having such high rates of poverty. As I mentioned earlier, the extent and depth of poverty in the United States is by far greater than any other Western industrialized country, as is the extent of our economic inequality. As a result, we wind up spending a lot of money on social problems that poverty is associated with. So we wind up with greater health care problems, family problems, a less able workforce, and so on down a long list. There was a report that came out a number of years ago by the Children's Defense Fund, which is an advocacy group in Washington for children, particularly children from low-income backgrounds. And it talked about the cost of childhood poverty. And it's a very powerful quote, and I'll quote it for you here. What they said was, "The children who suffer poverty's effects are not its only victims. When children do not succeed as adults, all of society pays the price. Businesses are able to find fewer good workers. Consumers pay more for their goods. Hospital and health insurers spend more treating preventable illnesses. Teachers spend more time on remediation and special education. Private citizens feel less safe on the streets. Governors hire more prison guards. Mayors must pay to shelter homeless families. Judges must hear more criminal, domestic, and other cases. Taxpayers pay for problems that could have prevented. Fire and medical workers must respond to emergencies that never should have happened. And funeral directors must bury children who never should have died, unquote. So when we speak about issues like homeland security, these are the issues that truly undermine our security as a nation. In short, each of us pays a tremendous price for allowing so many of our citizens and so many of our communities to be mired in poverty. Now, what might the dollar price be of that? There had been a couple of research studies that looked at this question of the economic cost of poverty, but there was a need for a more recent study. And so in response to this, what I and a graduate student at Washington University did was to focus on the question of estimating the annual dollar cost of childhood poverty in the United States. What we did is we used the latest research to estimate the cost of poverty in several different areas. So these included the effect that childhood poverty has on lowering future economic productivity, the effect of childhood poverty on increasing healthcare costs, and the effect of childhood poverty upon raising criminal justice costs. Now, we know that poverty in childhood results in less economic productivity when children become adults. It results in higher healthcare costs, and it raises the costs associated with increased crime and incarceration. And we were very conservative in terms of how we measured these costs. And there were also many other potential costs that we couldn't include in the analysis just because we didn't have enough data to do that. So what our calculations might be thought of as a lower estimate or a very conservative estimate in terms of what the economic price of childhood poverty is. Well, when we sum together these costs, the overall estimate was that in 2015, childhood poverty in the United States was costing the nation slightly over $1 trillion a year. To put this into perspective, that was approximately 28% of the entire federal budget for 2015. The other calculation that we made was a cost-benefit analysis of reducing poverty. And our estimate was that for every dollar we spend on reducing childhood poverty, we would save between $7 and $12 in the future by reducing the economic and social costs of poverty. As a result, we argue that reducing childhood poverty is not only the morally right thing to do, but it's economically the smart thing to do as well. So the bottom line is that the price of childhood poverty is exceedingly high. And by allowing poverty to exist at such levels, we wind up spending considerably more in many areas than if poverty were substantially reduced. Impoverishment can lead to serious health problems, inadequately educated children, and higher rates of criminal activity. As a result, we pay more for health care, we produce less productive workers, and we divert resources into the building and maintaining of correctional facilities. In each of these cases, we're spending our money on the back end of the problem rather than on the front end, which is almost always a more expensive approach to take. The old saying of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure is very apropos. So it's not a question of paying or not paying. It's a question of how we want to pay, which then affects the amount we wind up spending. And the argument is that by underinvesting in a segment of the population, the economy loses some of its potential human capital. On the other hand, social policies that invest in education, health, and skill development are rewarded with a more dynamic and innovative workforce. This, in turn, helps to create greater economic growth and productivity for the society as a whole. So by making an investment up front to alleviate poverty, the evidence suggests that we will be repaid many times over in the lower costs associated with a host of social problems, as well as a more robust economy. So in short, each of us pays dearly in a number of ways for letting poverty exist at such levels, although unfortunately we too often fail to see this connection. But there's a second way of thinking about why does poverty affect us all? And that is, what are the chances that an average American will directly encounter poverty at some point during their lifetime? Now, as I began thinking about this question a number of years ago, we knew very little about what that risk was. We have a lot of data on how many folks are poor in a given year, maybe how many folks are poor in a 3 or 4 year period, but we didn't know anything about the lifetime risk. And so there's a longitudinal data set that's called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. And it's been following a nationally representative sample of households every year since 1968. So my colleague Tom Herschel at Cornell and I have been able to use that data set to provide an answer to the question of what's the lifetime risk of poverty. And it turns out that the number of Americans who are touched by poverty during their lifetimes is actually really high. So our data indicates that depending on how we define and how we measure poverty, between the ages of 20 and 75, nearly 60% of Americans will experience at least 1 year below the poverty line, and 3/4 of Americans will experience a year either in poverty or very near poverty. Perhaps even more surprising is the fact that half of all American children at some point during their childhood will reside in a household that uses the SNAP program or food stamp program for some period of time. Consequently, although the users of safety net programs are routinely vilified and portrayed as members of marginalized groups, in fact, many Americans will encounter the welfare system at some point during their lives. Now, if we look at poverty from the broader perspective of significant economic insecurity rather than just poverty, then we find an even higher rate of incidence. So in my book that I did a number of years ago called Chasing the American Dream, we constructed an overall measure of economic insecurity that included either using a social safety net program, falling below 150% of the poverty line, or having the head of household unemployed at some point during the year. And if you use that combined measure, then you find that 4 out of 5 Americans will experience at least 1 year of significant economic insecurity between the ages of 25 and 60, and half the population will experience 3 or more years of economic insecurity. Now, people often ask me when I talk about this, how can those percentages be so high? The reason why they're so high is, again, think about this. We're looking over a long period of time, over a 30 or 40-year period in people's lives. And during that period of time, any number of things can happen to people, many of which are unexpected and detrimental. So things like losing a job, a family splitting up, getting sick, having a pandemic occur. When these events occur, there's not a lot to protect individuals from downward economic mobility and potentially poverty. For example, the social safety net programs that we have in this country are actually quite weak. So rather than a risk that affects a few on the fringes of society, it turns out that poverty and the use of welfare are events that actually strike the vast majority of American citizens. And as Michael mentioned, I've developed a website and what's known as a poverty risk calculator where you can go after this talk, not right now, but when you go home, if you want to get depressed. And it asks you for 4 or 5 demographic characteristics, and you can put those in, and you can see actually, based on that, what your risk of poverty will be in the next 5, 10, or 15 years. It's the same idea of the heart disease risk calculators that are out there, but it's based on hundreds of thousands of points of data is put into this calculator. Another thing I want to point out here is that recent research has shown that the life course risk of poverty and economic instability has actually been rising over the last 30 or 40 years. So more and more families, including middle-class families, are experiencing greater volatility and downward swings in their income as a result of greater instability in the labor market and the lack of benefits such as health and unemployment insurance. Jobs are no longer as stable as they once were. Retirement benefits are harder to get. The safety net has been weakened over time, and so on. What's happened is there's been a shift in economic risk that has been happening in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years. And this shift in economic risk has been from government and businesses once shouldering a good portion of that risk onto the backs now of individuals and families. So that today for individuals, job stability is much less. People are less likely to have retirement benefits, the social safety net has been weakened, and so on. And this is a fundamentally different understanding of the issue, and one that implies that we all have a direct self-interest in addressing the issues of poverty. And as we all know, self-interest is really the gold standard in terms of motivating people. There was a quote from a former Australian Prime Minister who once wrote in the London Daily Telegraph. He said, "The odds makers know that the horse named morality rarely gets past the post, whereas the horse named self-interest always runs a good race." And I think this is quite appropriate today in the running of the Kentucky Derby. So I think it's a very valid point. So my first point here is that what we need to do is see poverty as something that affects us all in one way or another, and consequently, that the reduction of poverty is in all of our self-interests. Okay, a second change in thinking that I believe is really necessary before we can make much progress in reducing poverty is to recognize that American poverty is largely the result of failings at the economic and political levels rather than at the individual level. Now, in the past, we've emphasized individual inadequacies as really the major reason for poverty. And so people just aren't motivated enough, they aren't working hard enough, they don't have enough skills in their education, they made bad decisions, and so on. And that these are the things that lead people into poverty, and therefore it's their fault that they find themselves in poverty. And in fact, this is the way that we often view social problems in this country, and that is as individual pathology. Now, in contrast to this perspective, the argument that I want to make is that the fundamental problem lies in the fact that there simply are not enough viable opportunities for all Americans. Now, it's certainly true that particular individual shortcomings, such as a lack of education or skills, helps to explain who's more likely to be left out in the competition to locate and find good opportunities, but it can't explain why there's a shortage of such opportunities in the first place. In order to answer that question, we must turn to the inability of the economic and political structures to provide the supports and opportunities necessary to lift all Americans out of poverty. And the most obvious example of this is the mismatch between the number of decent paying jobs versus the pool of labor in search of such jobs. So over the past 50 years, the United States economy has been producing more and more low-paying jobs, part-time jobs, and jobs that are lacking in benefits. It's estimated that between 1/4 to 1/3 of all jobs today in the United States are considered low-paying. And of course, beyond these low-paying jobs, there are millions of Americans that are unemployed at any point in time. Unemployment right now is at a historic low, but it's still around 4%. The U.S. has also failed to offer the types of universal coverage for things like child care, health care, and affordable housing that most other developed countries routinely provide. And the result of all this is an increasing number of families at risk of economic vulnerability and poverty. And one way that I've tried to illustrate this in my work is through the analogy of musical chairs. So picture a game up here of musical chairs in which we have 10 players, but only 8 chairs available at any point in time. Now, who's more likely to lose out at this game? Well, those more likely to lose out will tend to have characteristics that put them at a disadvantage in terms of competing for those chairs, such as maybe they're not as agile, they're not as quick, they were in a bad position when the music stops, and so on. And we can point to these reasons for why those two individuals lost out at the game. However, given that the game is structured in a way that 2 players are bound to lose, then these individual attributes only explain who in particular loses out, not why there are losers in the first place. Unfortunately, those 2 people have lost out because there weren't enough chairs for everyone playing the game. And the critical mistake that we've made in the past is we've equated the question of who loses out at the game with the question of why the game produces losers in the first place. They are, in fact, distinct and separate questions. So while characteristics like deficiencies in skills or education or being in a single-parent family help to explain who in the population is at a heightened risk of encountering poverty, the fact that poverty exists in the first place results not from these characteristics, but rather from a failure of the economic and political structures to provide enough decent opportunities and supports for everyone in society. By focusing solely on individual characteristics, for example, education, we can shuffle individual people up or down in terms of their being more likely to land a job with good earnings, But we're still going to have somebody lose out if there aren't enough decent paying jobs to go around. In short, I would make the argument we're playing a large-scale version of musical chairs in which there are many more players than chairs available. And the recognition of this is really a fundamental shift in thinking from the past. And it helps to explain why the social policies over the last 4 or 5 decades have largely been ineffective in reducing poverty in the US. What we've done is we've focused our attention and resources on either altering the incentives and disincentives for those playing the game through various welfare reform measures, or in a very limited way, upgrading their skills and ability to compete in the game through various job training programs, while at the same time we've left the structure of the game untouched. Now, when the overall rates of poverty do in fact go up or down, they do so primarily as a result of changes on the structural level that increase or decrease the number of available chairs. In particular, the performance of the economy has been historically important. Why? Because when the economy is expanding, more opportunities or chairs in this analogy are available for the competing pool of labor and their families. The reverse occurs when the economy slows down and contracts. Likewise, changes in various social supports and the safety net will make a difference in terms of how well families are able to avoid poverty or near poverty. When those supports were increased through the War on Poverty initiatives in the 1960s, poverty rates declined substantially. Likewise, when Social Security benefits were expanded during the 1960s and 1970s, the elderly's poverty rate dropped dramatically. Or when we temporarily implemented the child tax credit on a monthly basis in 2021, as part of the pandemic relief effort, child poverty rates also fell substantially. The recognition of poverty as a structural failing also makes it quite clear why the United States has such high rates of poverty compared to other Western countries. These rates have nothing to do with Americans being less motivated or less skilled than those in other countries, but with the fact that our economy has been producing millions of low-wage jobs in the face of global competition, and that our social policies have done relatively little to economically support families compared to other industrialized countries. So from this perspective, one of the keys to addressing poverty is to increase the labor market opportunities and the social supports available to American households. So this is, I think, a second really important shift in thinking, is to recognize the fundamental distinction between understanding who loses out at the game versus understanding how and why the game produces losers in the first place. So let me now turn to the third shift in thinking that I think really needs to occur. And that is that the moral ground on which we view poverty in America, I think, really needs to change. In the past, our moral perspective has largely been rooted in the ethos of individual blame. That is, poverty is often seen as the fault of the individual, that individuals are largely to blame for the situation, and consequently, that the rest of society bears very little responsibility for their plight. The result of all this is an acceptance of the status quo of high poverty and a lack of initiative to address it. In other words, it's your problem and responsibility, not mine. And I believe that we must change the moral ground on which poverty is viewed from one of individual blame to one of injustice. In my view, poverty represents an injustice of a substantial magnitude. It constitutes severe deprivation and hardship. This has been documented in countless studies, not to mention millions of human lives. And as I argued earlier, much of this poverty is the result of failings at the structural rather than the individual level. But what makes this injustice particularly grievous is the stark contrast between the wealth, abundance, and resources of America on the one hand, and its levels of destitution on the other hand. Something is seriously wrong when we find that in a country with the greatest resources in the world, there are children without enough to eat, families who can't afford health care, and people who are sleeping on the streets. Or that the life expectancy in some parts of the United States are less than they are in Bangladesh. Or that the difference in life expectancy in some metropolitan areas in the US can vary by as much as 20 years, depending on the zip code that you're residing in. And I should note that the gap between prosperity and poverty has never been wider. There was a very famous economist by the name of Paul Samuelson, and he had a very well-known introductory economics textbook. And in the first edition of that textbook, which came out in 1948, he observed that if we were to make an income pyramid out of a child's play blocks, with each layer representing $1,000 of income, the peak in 1948 would be a little bit higher than the Eiffel Tower, and most of us would be within a yard or so of the ground. This is 1948. By the time of Samuelson's 2001 edition of the textbook, most of us still would be within a few yards of the ground, but the Eiffel Tower would now have to be replaced with Mount Everest to represent those at the top of the income distribution. Or take what's happened with respect to the distance between the average worker's salary and the average CEO's salary. In 1980, the average CEO of a major corporation earned around 40 times that of the average worker's pay. Today, it's well over 300 times. Adding insult to injury, during the past 50 years, an increasing number of companies have demanded concessions from their workers, including pay cuts and the elimination of health benefits in order to keep their labor costs down, while those at the top have prospered really beyond any sense of decency. And if we look at patterns of wealth accumulation, then the story is even more skewed. So today in America, we find that the top 1% of the US population currently own 42% of the entire financial wealth in the country, while the bottom 60% of Americans are in possession of less than 1% of the country's financial wealth. And while all of these things have been happening, our social policies have continued to give more and more to the well-to-do and less to the economically vulnerable, with the argument that these policies have been helping all Americans. A new way of thinking recognizes this as moral outrage. Injustice rather than blame becomes the moral compass on which to view poverty amidst abundance. This type of injustice constitutes a strong impetus for change. It signals that a wrong is being committed that cries out for a remedy. A shift in thinking recognizes this and is premised on the idea that social change is essential in addressing the injustices of poverty. And again, this is in sharp contrast with the old way of thinking, in which the moral focus is on individual blame. That's had the effect of simply reinforcing the status quo of doing very little, resulting in continued high rates of poverty. So the perspective of injustice allows us to actively engage and confront poverty rather than comfortably settling for the status quo of widespread impoverishment. All right, so to sum up, three, I think, really key changes that I've been talking about with respect to understanding poverty in a new light are, first of all, to recognize that poverty in one way or another affects us all. Second, that poverty is largely the result of weaknesses at the economic and policy levels. And third, that policy is a moral injustice in a country with the resources that the United States has. Now, of course, the question that arises is always, well, can we move our thinking as a society towards such a framework? And it would be very foolish of me not to acknowledge that accomplishing the changes that I'm talking about here will certainly be an uphill battle. But I also don't think that that should immobilize us, because social change can and does occur. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. At the end of my book that I mentioned earlier, Chasing the American Dream, I pulled out a quote from somebody in one of our focus groups. We interviewed a lot of people, and we did focus groups and all kinds of things. And this group was wrestling with the idea of how positive change can come about on a national level. And after a lot of discussion, a fellow by the name of Bill had the floor. And this is what he said, quoting. So he says, "So what do you do that lets you go beyond the local level? And I can't give precise answers to that, but I can give a generic answer, and that is organization. I think the history of the country and the world show that in any society at any time there is a struggle between those who want to dominate politically, socially, economically, and control everything, and those who want to live their lives in a broader, comfortable way, but they don't feel the need to own vast amounts. They just want enough. And some call that class struggle. And the only thing that has ever won, the larger number of people win against the small number that controls the money and the power, has been organization. And Mary made a comment a little while ago that she'll be dust before we see major social change. And I think that's a mistake. Again, I think if you look at history, what I see is that social change has come very rapidly when it's come, and usually to everyone's surprise. People are always trying to organize, and every once in a while something clicks and it all happens. And I can't explain what it's going to take to make it click. All I can say is that you keep trying to organize. But you look at Jim Crow was around for 100 years and it collapsed in about 5. The Soviet Union was around for 70 or 80 years and it fell apart in months. And I think that there's a very real possibility that things like that can happen. And I don't know when they'll happen or what's going to trigger them or what's going to make it work, but when it happens, it'll surprise you and it'll be fast, unquote. Take a different example. There's been a dramatic change in how we've come to view the physical environment over a relatively short period of time. And as a result, we've put in place some significant legislation dealing with environmental protections. Our thinking has shifted from one of environmental damage and pollution being someone else's problem to recognizing it as a problem that affects us all. And that represents a profound change in thinking, which has led to a profound change in acting. But the change in how we understood the environment had to occur before we were able to enact legislation dealing with environmental protections. It was the notion that environmental degradation affects all of us, which has caused our actions and policies to change. And that's the kind of change in thinking that now is needed with respect to American poverty if we're ever going to be able to effectively tackle this program. We need a new framework in which to understand poverty and inequality in America and how to go about solving those problems. There's a fabulous quote from Martin Luther King in his last book that was entitled, "Where do we go from here, chaos or community?" And in that book he writes, "A true revolution of value will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be beaten and robbed as they make their journey through life. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth," unquote. So I would say, let's begin as concerned citizens to engage in the process of transforming the mindset and ultimately the approaches we use to address the problems of poverty and inequality in America. The question then arises, which could be a whole nother lecture or talk, would be what might some of those strategies and approaches be? In other words, to go back to my musical chairs analogy, what kind of strategies would provide more chairs for the players playing the game? And in my book, The Poverty Paradox, I talk a lot about different strategies, and I'll just very quickly just mention a couple of those. I think the most important one is being able to create adequately paying jobs. There's lots of ways to think about that, raising the minimum wage to a living wage, expanding the earned income tax credit. There's a lot of different policies there, but I think that's a critical one of getting more jobs that pay a decent wage. A second strategy is increasing the accessibility of key social and public goods. What are these things? Every child should be entitled to a quality education. I believe every American should have access to health care. We are very much the outlier in the world in terms of not having some kind of universal health care. Affordable housing is really critical. Certainly here in Santa Fe, you know that that's an issue. Having universal access to childcare and affordable childcare would be another key social and public good. So that would be a second kind of strategy. A third strategy would be the idea of building low-income folks' assets. We have a lot of policies that build middle-income folks' assets and upper-income folks' assets, but not a lot at the lower end of the income distribution. We can think very creatively about how to do that. And then finally, I think we need to have a much more effective and a much more robust social safety net. But all of these policies have the effect of, again, providing more chairs for those in the musical chairs analogy, rather than just shuffling people around. Yet again, in order for such policies to fully develop, I believe we have to begin by changing our understanding and our way of thinking about American poverty. And so this brings to mind two of my very favorite quotations that will serve on kind of an appropriate note to end my comments on. The first one comes from George Bernard Shaw, who wrote, "Progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." The second quote is one that you might be familiar with, and that's the importance of individuals and groups such as yourselves in order to create such a change. It comes from the anthropologist Margaret Mead, who wrote, "Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So here's what I hope and what I believe. Just as we've looked back in our history and wondered, how could we have allowed slavery to exist? How could we have denied women the right to vote? How could we have blatantly discriminated against so many groups? One day we'll look back at amazement and outrage at the time that we allowed so many of our citizens to be mired in poverty and did so little to prevent it. That realization will come about from a new way of thinking and understanding poverty. And I believe such a change in perception will occur in the future and will lead to a profound change in acting towards poverty amidst plenty. But it begins with each of us. It begins with the conversations we have, with the behaviors and actions we engage in, and with the organizing efforts that we're a part of. I believe that each of us has a role to play in moving the country towards the vision of a more sustainable and more humane future where everyone is allowed to reach their full potential and where no one is stunted or held back by the conditions of poverty. And so with that, I hope I've given you a bit of something to think about, and thanks so much for listening.